In this video, I'm going to give you the top 5 things that I'd be looking out for when buying a Class D amplifier. Hey guys, thank you for tuning back into the channel once again. If you're new around here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell to keep updated with the latest from this channel. And if you are enjoying this content, don't forget to hit that like button and help get this video out there. So in this video, I want to talk to you about Class D amplifiers. As you can see, I've got a Aguilar Tonehammer 500 behind me here, but I want to talk to you more about what I'd be considering when going out to purchase a Class D amp today. The days of the Tonehammer 500, which was kind of the mid-2010s, they're kind of behind us and things have moved on a little bit. Amplifiers like this are still sold, the Tonehammer 500 is still sold, but I think there was a bit of a step forward when it got to about maybe 2018, 2019, and so I want to talk to you about the things I'd be considering if I went and bought a Class D amp today. I'll be giving you my top 5 tips. They're all just my opinion and my experience from having played a few different Class D amps. And I mean, they're everywhere now. If you go to a gig, turn up to a show for backline, quite a lot of the time it's not going to be a traditional big heavy solid state amp or a traditional tube amp. What you're going to find is it's just a Class D amp. And they are all around and they're really delivering the goods for most of us players out there. So I'm going to give you my top 5 tips when buying one. My first tip would be make sure that you get a compact Class D head. Typically if you want Class D, you're wanting a Class D head because it's lightweight, you can pop it in a gig bag, any of those kind of small lightweight features, which is what Class D gives us over a traditional amplifier. So I would be looking to make it as small as possible. And I mean, even this Tonehammer 500 is probably a bit deep for me. I'd rather it's a little bit smaller, but I have a carry bag for it. It came with a little gig bag, so I'm kind of alright for that. But quite often I would want something really slim and light, so something like the Ike T900 or any of those really compact Class D amps. If you can get it in a smaller package, then go for it. My second tip would be that tubes don't matter. When it comes to Class D amps, quite often you'll see manufacturers touting the fact that it's got a tube front end and then the Class D back end. For me, I've never really felt like I've got much out of the tubes on the front end of any Class D amp. Whether it was the orange Terabase 500 or the Mark-based little tube, I just really didn't get enough out of it to make a difference for me. And this Tonehammer here is plenty in terms of the amount of drive and saturation and the cool little tricks you can do with the drive knob on the front of it. So for me, I would actually just steer clear of tubes in a Class D amp. The other thing is you've got Class D amps, they're lighter, they're likely to be thrown around a bit more, and if you've got tubes in the front end of them, that's something else to go wrong. And for me, the thing I love about a Class D amp is that it's super lightweight and it's reliable. There's not as much to go wrong, so I would stick to solid state. That's my personal taste. Other people have different opinions, but I've never found that tubes made that much of a difference to me on a Class D head. Tip number 3 would be to get a Class D amp with an effects return. Having an effects return is going to change the versatility of your Class D amp, and it's going to make it so that you could use it as just a power amp on its own, a clean, clear power amp, and put whatever you want in the front end. That means you don't have to use the preamp that's built into the amp you've got with you. You can just bypass it and use the power section. That opens up a whole world of opportunity. So if you paired something, or anything, be it a Tonehammer, an Ike amp, any amp with an effects return, what you've given yourself there is a clean power section that you could then feed with something like a Helix. You could feed with a pedal, a preamp pedal of your choice, you know, anything from the thousands pretty much of preamp pedals there are out there now. You could have any of those run as the front end for your bass rig and just use the power section in the amp. And that's giving you even more options. So you've not only got the sound that comes in that amp with the preamp, but you've also got 100 other preamp options. And like I say, something like the Helix where you could take a preamp block and run that straight into the front of the amp. You know, the possibilities are endless. So I'd personally be looking for a Class D amp with an effects return. Tip number 4, and probably the biggest one for me since the newest generation of Class D amps, is to get the Class D amp with as big a wattage as possible. Now, this is a bit of a sticking point and a bit funny because certain manufacturers will rate the same power amp as more powerful than others. So whilst one person might be using the same power section. Typically they're made by Ice Power, and almost every manufacturer uses these Ice Power modules. One manufacturer will rate it for 700 watts while another will rate it for 900 watts. Ignore that in general, but aim for the kind of bracket. So the first kind of tier of Class D amp is really about 300 watts, 200 to 300 watts. That's going to typically be one of the Ice Power modules or one of the Class D modules that are standard in the industry. Then you have the 500 to 600, 400 to 600 range, which is going to be a different type of module and is going to be the one that you'll find in something like the Tonehammer 500. And then you have the next bracket up, which is the 700 to 1000 watts. And I really think that the sweet spot for the new Class D heads is that range, the 700 to 1000, 1100 watt range. And that is the point at which people have stopped saying, oh, my Class D amp, doesn't quite have as much grunt as a solid state head. I think personally I've found that when you get to that level of power from your Class D amp, you kind of start forgetting about all those typical Class D things of, oh, it runs out of power, and if you have a sustained load through it, it doesn't give as strongly and as clearly and as consistently as something like, this big Aguilar DB751 I've got beneath me here. Whilst it doesn't, and it can't, because the way Class D works, it turns on and off, it's never going to be consistent. I've noticed that those more powerful, bigger headroom amps do make a massive difference in terms of the tone and feel. And so you start to feel like you've got that traditional amp behind you that's going to just keep giving and giving and giving. So that would be my tip number 4, would be any of the more modern amps to look for those 700 to 1000 watt heads. They're going to be more expensive, but at that point you're really going to be competing with those traditional solid state and tube heads. And my tip number 5, which is kind of a bonus tip really, would just be to get one with a mute button. I used the Fender 800 HD, which I really liked as a head, but I really wished it had a mute button. The Aguilar stuff has mute buttons, the Ike stuff have mute buttons. Pretty much, all the decent, well thought out Class D heads have those buttons on them, and they're just so useful. It's just nice to be able to turn around, press the mute button, and forget about everything, not worry about it. You come on stage, press it, start playing. You get off stage, as you're leaving stage, press the button, and you don't have to worry about it when you're packing down or anything later on. So that would be my tip number 5. So those are my thoughts when it comes to buying a Class D amp. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I know it's a bit of a contentious topic and people have different opinions, but those are just my top 5 tips. In my experience from using a whole host, from Fender to Ike to Mark Bass, the Aguilar stuff I've got behind me now, I really do think that since that later 2010s era, they've got so much better. And really, do we need to have these massive heavy amps? Probably not, but I do quite like having them. But realistically, they are, these new Class D amps do compete. So go and check them out if you haven't, or you've moved away from Class D for a while. They're worth checking out. And I've got this one here pretty much as a backup, and for small gigs I don't need it to provide tons and tons of power, but I'm fortunate enough to be able to afford to do that and to make a living from it. But if you're doing it kind of semi-pro or whatever, then having one nice great Class D amp is probably the best thing you could do in terms of securing your amplification's reliability, portability, and just making sure that you have a great tone. So let me know your thoughts in the comments. My Instagram will be linked below, and I will see you in the next video.